On the heels of Secretary of State Tony Blinken's visit to Beijing, where he met with President Xi himself, we are here today for a webinar from the Quincy Institute to discuss the takeaways from this trip and a recent paper we have published, authored by my own colleague, Michael D. Swaine, and Quincy Institute CEO, Andrew Bacevich, titled A Restraint Approach to U.S.-China Relations, Reversing the Slide Toward Crisis and Conflict. The Quincy Institute is an action-oriented think tank focused on foreign policy, based in Washington, that advocates a grand strategy of restraint. We aim to move U.S. foreign policy away from endless war and toward vigorous diplomacy, economic engagement, and the combating of existential threats such as climate change. Our vision is a world where peace is the norm and war the exception. I'm Sarang Shidore, Director of Studies and Senior Research Fellow at the Quincy Institute, welcoming you to this show today. And I'm going to start by introducing our panelists. And I'm going to start with the key author of this paper that we're going to talk about today, who's Michael D. Swaine himself. He is a Senior Research Fellow at the Quincy Institute's East Asia program and one of the most prominent American scholars of Chinese security studies. He comes to Quincy Institute from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he worked for nearly 20 years as a senior fellow specializing in Chinese defense and foreign policy, U.S.China relations, and East Asian international relations. Swaine served as a senior policy analyst at the RAND Corporation, and he has authored and edited more than a dozen books and monographs, including Remaining Aligned on the Challenges Facing Taiwan with Ryo Sahashi in 2019, Conflict and Cooperation in the Asia-Pacific region, A Strategic Net Assessment with Nicholas Eberstadt et al., 2015, and many journal articles and book chapters. We also have with us today Michael J. Mazar. He's a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation. Previously, he worked at the U.S. National War College, where he was professor and associate dean of academics. As president of the Henry L. Stimson Center, senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, senior defense aide on Capitol Hill, a special assistant to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And his primary interests are U.S. defense policy and force structure, disinformation and information manipulation, East Asian security, nuclear weapons and deterrence, and judgment and decision-making under uncertainty. Mazar holds a PhD in public policy from the University of Maryland. We also have with us Kristen Gunnis. She's a senior policy researcher in the RAND Corporation's Washington office. Her background includes military security and foreign policy issues in the Indo-Pacific region with a focus on China. She's worked with a range of DoD and private sector clients throughout her career and advised senior leaders in the Navy, OSD, PACOM, and the intelligence community. Gunnis has been an adjunct policy analyst at RAND since 2012, where she has worked on numerous projects related to Chinese military developments and their impact on U.S. and DoD interests. Before joining RAND, Gunnis served as the director of the Navy Asia Pacific Advisory Group at the Pentagon, and she holds a BA from Tufts University in International Relations and an MA in Security Studies from Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service. So you can see that we have quite a distinguished panel here today to talk about this paper and also what's been going on in the last few days. I'm going to start with the events of the last few days, where, of course, as we know, Secretary Blinken completed a visit to Beijing, where he had extensive conversations with Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang. He also met with President Xi, and both sides expressed cautiously positive reactions to the talks. So I want to get first from our panelists, starting with you, Kristen, a sense of what has happened in the last 3 days. We also saw yesterday President Biden call President Xi a dictator, quote unquote, which has induced a reaction in Beijing. So looking at the last 3 or 4 days between US and China relations, what do you see? What are the takeaways? What is the chance of this initial thaw sustaining? Kristen, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me on this panel. I'm very honored. So that is a good question. I've looked a bit at Chinese reporting because that's what I do for my job. But there does not seem to be, from China's perspective, I think a lot of progress toward resolving any of the key structural issues that have led Chinese counterparts to make statements. For example, that the U.S.-China relationship is at the lowest point since its establishment. And I think that from the Chinese perspective, the root cause is still that the U.S. is misperceiving China, and that is leading to these sort of, from their perspective, misguided China policies. So it does seem like that perception remains on China's side, despite the high-level meeting. But I do think that domestic politics is driving a lot of the response in China's side and also on the U.S. side. And it's worth noting, for example, that Xi Jinping is likely facing a great deal of domestic pressure to not look too conciliatory or weak when dealing with the United States, while also having to deal with a slowing economy. So domestic factors are a key driver of the position and actions that we're seeing Beijing undertake now. Xi Jinping is now facing a domestic environment where economic growth, which is one of the key pillars of CCP legitimacy, has slowed, and that puts China's economic recovery into question. And reviving that growth is sure to be one of the primary concerns of Xi Jinping and the broader Chinese leadership. And to do that, Beijing needs a stable relationship with Washington, if not a friendly one. So, and there are also economic opportunities that Beijing would likely want to take advantage of, such as the upcoming APEC summit. So I think overall that while the meeting likely didn't provide any large breakthroughs in the relationship in various areas, it did serve to break the ice and navigate bilateral ties potentially back onto a more solid footing. So at least we can be, I think, cautiously optimistic that things might get slightly better from here, since that high-level communications channel appears to be open now.
Great. Michael Mazar, domestic politics was there before Sunday. It's there today. Yet the two sides took that step. They met in Beijing, and not just for 30 minutes. They met, we saw Blinken meet with Qin Gang for 7.5 hours, as it was reported. So clearly they're trying to overcome this. But where are we now after these 3 days? What do you think will happen in the coming weeks and months?
Well, I agree basically with Kristen's kind of conception of it. I think, even in some of the reporting and the commentary around the visit, domestic politics is coming out where you see some of the reports being critical of the administration for allegedly withholding some information about Chinese intelligence gathering, slow rolling some potential investment restrictions, things like that. So the general context for the relationship is still extremely fraught. And I think, that we're going to see a little bit of a race or a continual tension between the effort by both sides. I think Kristen's exactly right. From the Chinese side, continuing in a decades-long tradition of sort of pragmatically balancing their desire to, in some ways, confront the United States with a need to maintain good relations for economic purposes, and the U.S. wanting to kind of stabilize things. You're going to see a contest between those efforts and other elements of the structural relationship that are on a trajectory that seem just destined to increase tensions. And we'll talk about the issue of Taiwan. That is, of course, the leading one, as Michael describes in his paper. And as the U.S. relationship with Taiwan, especially the security relationship, continues to mature, as Chinese activities, such as those reported by the Wall Street Journal in Cuba, continue, the open question is whether each side can manage those trajectories without completely undermining what I think is a very real and pragmatic desire to keep the overall relationship, in some sort of equilibrium.
Michael Swaine destined to get worse, or is there still some possibility of this thing moving in the right direction? And we are going to get your paper just right after this, but just
Right.
tell us your capture of what's happened in the last 3 days.
Right. Well, thanks, Sarang, and thanks to Mike and to Kristen for participating in this webinar, and for Quincy to do this based on our paper. I agree with everything that's been said. I think the Blinken trip has possibly begun a process here of what I hope will be many meetings, particularly among functionaries on both sides, that's designed not only to put a floor under the relationship, but to genuinely try to reduce tensions and provide a basis for, dare I say it, some level of cooperation in dealing with some critical issues between the two countries. But it's taken us over 2 years to get to this, with an enormous amount of wasted time and a steady deepening in the meantime of distrust, fiery rhetoric, finger pointing, all kinds. This is going to make it much more difficult to build a more stable and more productive relationship. And the structural issues, of course, are there and cannot be easily overcome. In fact, they can't be completely overcome, as Mike has suggested. But, I think we really need to get to a point now where we can correct some of the perceptions and misperceptions that have been so dominant in this relationship over time. I think that the U.S., for its part, has really overreached in a lot of ways in countering China, and downplayed the need to really reach some very serious understandings to address common threats that the two countries share. I think it's working from an inflated sense of the threat that China poses to the U.S. It's underestimated the concern of other countries about the trajectory of U.S.-China relations. And I think a lot of this Blinken trip can be explained, and a lot of the messaging in that trip can be explained by the concerns that have been expressed by allies and others about where this relationship is going. The U.S. is also, I think, moving closer towards Taiwan in ways that are eroding the credibility of its one China policy. That is not changing. The Chinese are doing, for its side, similar things and eroding the credibility of their commitment to peaceful unification. And we don't have a clear sense yet of what the limits are in economic and technological de-risking, as it's now called. And of course, the administration has really, in my view, not pushed back against the more extreme ideological views that are coming out of the Congress on this. Now, the Chinese aren't blameless by any means on this either. They think the United States is absolutely committed to containing them, undermining them, weakening China as a nation, not just the Chinese regime. And I think they believe that Blinken and the U.S. just want to create guardrails only to allow more threatening zero-sum competition, but preventing it from veering into conflict. So you've got this deep suspicion, deep distrust that still exists on both sides, that are based on certain assumptions and misperceptions in some ways, and each side blames the other. If you notice in the messaging, it's always about what the other side is doing to undermine the relationship, with no indication that one's own country in some ways could be doing things that could be contributing to the problem. In other words, the problem is an interactive dynamic. It's not one side threatening the other. So they've got to find a middle ground in this to be able to create some substantive, constructive relations going forward. I hope they do. I hope that incidents like the balloon incident that don't just completely knock things off again, and the Congress jumps in and starts demanding all kinds of crazy things be done. But that's the danger that we face. And I think there needs to be some clear, responsible messaging by both sides that tamps down this kind of shrill rhetoric and really tries to establish a substantive basis for compromise on both sides.
So let's stay with you, Michael Swaine, and this is a good moment for us to open up the paper that I should also mention was co-authored by Quincy Institute CEO Andrew Bacevich. But can you sort of, we have time to get into the specifics of the paper, but at a high level, can you tell us what are the big takeaways from your paper, the high points? What should the U.S. policy toward China be from a restraint perspective?
Well, from a let me begin though, Sarang, by stating very briefly what I think the underlying assumptions are that drive this analysis, because I think it's really important to know that where we're coming from in advocating the kind of things we're advocating in this paper. So let me say that there's just a quick sort of 5 or 6 things that I'll be very, very brief on. The first is that the United States certainly needs to have a strong military, second to none, but not globally dominant in the way in which it is today. It needs to have vibrant, extensive trade, investment, technology development throughout the world with structures that support that. It needs to have a very effective diplomatic set of tools to operate with, which it, I believe, does not have today. And it has to have mutually supportive and friendly political, social relations with as many countries as possible in the world. That's one thing. The second thing is, the assumption is that the unipolar moment, if it ever existed, has ended. Conditions that had been thought to have elevated the United States to the status of a global military, political, and economic hegemon of sorts after 1989, the collapse of the Soviet Union, no longer exist, and they cannot be restored, in our view. So a multipolar order will indeed define basic international reality. The US and China have to realize that. Thirdly, the underlying assumption is that there are 2 dominant threats, truly dominant threats, to the United States and other nations in the world today. One of them is the possibility of large-scale nuclear conflict, most likely between the United States and China, and most likely over Taiwan. The other, or a very large conventional conflict, which could have enormous negative repercussions. And the second is the unchecked worsening of the climate crisis as the preeminent expression, really, of global economic, environmental degradation, pardon me. No other threats exceed these in their destructive consequences, we believe, for the world, really. And that means also that China doesn't really pose a truly existential threat to the United States, whether militarily, politically, or economically. This idea that China is this nothing but predatory nation, it's out to overturn the entire international order, establish a Sino-centric order, dominate the United States, replacing it as a global hegemon, I think are gross distortions of the reality of what the Chinese think they can do and what they think is in their interest to do. But at the same time, we recognize that China is by no means a benign power that doesn't pose any threats to the United States or other countries. It does act in some ways to weaken US influence and competitiveness on many issues. It does act to undermine US military dominance in the Western Pacific, no question about that, in the maritime element. And it does engage in some types of zero-sum levels of economic competition, steals American technology, etc. But this doesn't rise to the level, in our view, to surpass, to overcome the kinds of, or dominate over the kinds of other threats that we're talking about. And it means we really have to be able to have a judicious balance of both deterrence and reassurance with the Chinese. And we have to sort of right-size the Chinese threat to do that properly. And we have to recognize that, as I said earlier, the real threat is the interactive nature, the way in which our 2 countries interact with each other. And then finally, I would say that we recognize that if America really wants to be able to achieve its interests, defend its interests, advance its policy goals, it has to be able to improve its domestic capacity in a variety of different ways. People say this all the time, but it is so very true. The United States needs to be able to strengthen its technological innovation, its education, financial and other services. It has to get beyond this kind of endless zero-sum political carping that goes on between the Republicans and the Democrats and achieve a realistic understanding of the US role in the world. And it has to be able to strengthen the American capacity to compete. That is probably going to be the single most important thing the United States could do to advance its interests in the world. So what
I'm going to stop you right there, Michael, because I want our other panelists to chime in on these assumptions, because these are axiomatic.
Right.
If one doesn't agree with some of the key ones, especially the one that you pointed out about emerging multipolarity or a current multipolarity, that's a debate. But clearly, unipolarity is waning. And the second one was your understanding of threat. So, Michael Mazar, take the assumptions on for a moment, and then we are going to get into the specifics of the paper. But do you see these assumptions aligned with the way you look at things?
In a lot of ways, yes. And in fact, one of the things that struck me on reading the paper is that I think for the most part, these assumptions are very close to how most people in the administration view the world. They're really not different from the basic assumptions. For example, a strong military but not dominant. I mean, you can debate some of the language, but one of the leading themes of the last two national defense strategies is that the era of U.S. dominance that existed after the Cold War is gone, and we need new approaches, new strategies, new concepts and systems that reflect that reality. So in a lot of ways, I think there's a general acceptance of these. The one point where I think I have a different emphasis, and I think probably the administration does as well, and I think actually is a really interesting theme for us to talk about, and a big unresolved question is how precisely to characterize Chinese ambitions. I think I agree with you, Michael, that describing China as an existential threat in the sense that it wants to collapse the American system or something like that is not true. On the other hand, if nuclear war with China is an existential threat, then Chinese aggression that could lead to conflict that produces that nuclear war is absolutely an existential threat. And the question then becomes, how best do you prevent that kind of conflict? Mm-hmm. And I think, probably the vast majority of people inside and outside government who look at these issues are not on the extremes. They're not people who say, if we would just leave China alone, we'd have no trouble. And they're not people who say China is building landing craft to come ashore in San Diego. But exactly how best to characterize the level and intensity of Chinese ambitions, the degree of threat to U.S. and allied interests, is, I think, an issue that is very much both unstated and openly debated. But I think it leaves us in a place where there's not a lot of precise dialogue and discussion on that. The last thing I would say is, I do think that this is not only an American perception, as we all know, right? South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, many European countries have reacted significantly to increasing Chinese belligerence over the last 5 or so years. And the idea that Xi Jinping's China is a country that has expanded the scope of what it considers interests that it won't compromise on, and the urgency with which it is pushing those and the willingness to engage in coercive belligerence to do that is, I think, widely held among a lot of countries that deal with China, particularly those that have territorial disputes with China. So I think there's a real problem there, and that trajectory of Chinese behavior, to me, is the fundamental driver of the current issue. And so to say they're not an existential threat, I kind of agree at some level, but I think all the other assumptions aside, with which I have little problem, that question of just how much of a challenge or threat is China in the process of becoming is something where we may have a disagreement a bit, but beyond that is something that for the generation of American policy, we need much more kind of precise and focused discussions and debates to get to a point where we have a more shared understanding about it.
So Kristen, I want you to come in because here there's some daylight. I see. There is this idea of China as not being an existential threat, but there's also the argument from Mike Mazar that Chinese aggression, Chinese actions could open up a space where nuclear war emerges, and that is an existential threat. So I want you to take this on more broadly, of course, but also address whether this is just Chinese aggression that could cause us to get to the edge of nuclear war, or is it something that we are also doing? Is it a co-constituted cycle here that's at work?
Sure. Yes. So just before we get into that one, I just wanted to say what I really enjoyed the report, in that it includes a lot of elements that I think we'd want to include in any sensible approach to China, regardless of whether we adopt a grand strategy of restraint or not. For example, I really agree with the need to prioritize resources in an increasingly resource constrained environment, and that should be a feature of whatever U.S. approach to China that we take. And I also agree with both Dr. Swaine's and Dr. Mazar's points about how many countries around the world want to peacefully coexist with China, but also have a stable relationship with China and the United States. And in the Indo-Pacific region in particular, we see I've just done a lot of prior research and interviews in Singapore, the Philippines, and Indonesia, and we see many countries still preferring to balance, but also increasingly wary of China's coercive actions. So just piggybacking on what Mike said, I'm having a little bit of a hard time conceptualizing what the report states as right-sizing the China threat and what that would actually look like, because so many of the assumptions about Chinese intentions overlap in so many areas. And some of the assumptions laid out in the report are quite broad. And so just to your point, Sarang, even though there is, maybe not a lot of evidence that China is going to invade Taiwan tomorrow or in 2027, when you look at the trajectory of their military modernization program and that their military is really oriented toward a Taiwan contingency, along with now coercive actions in the gray zone that are, sort of at the lower end of the escalatory ladder, but can still definitely coerce Taiwan and other states in the region, and that Beijing has not renounced the use of force against Taiwan. So I think when we talk about these assumptions and right-sizing the China threat, it's important to examine them in a way that also includes acknowledging areas where China is or could be a threat. And again, a conflict over Taiwan may not go nuclear. It may not be an existential threat, but it could be. And so I think that looking at the different events trajectories and talking about those assumptions are important as well. I also think that many of the actions outlined in the report for the best case and worst case restraint scenarios depend on a certain level of trust on each side. And I don't see a lot of evidence that China is willing to trust the US much at all, which would make it pretty hard to do much beyond potentially a sustained rivalry. So I think there's something to unpack there about whether right-sizing the China threat would actually result in the level of trust required for some of these initiatives that are described in the report. And that would make sense to address some of the challenges like the environmental challenge that Dr. Swaine talked about. I'm a little skeptical given past history. And in that case, maybe the sustained rivalry outcome might be the best we can hope for, but I'd be curious to hear other panelists' reactions.
Great. Michael, I want to get to Taiwan because this is such a central issue. And we also have questions, by the way, coming in from the audience. Please put your questions in the Q&A box. There's one I see from William Duron, who wants us, I think, to come up with a solution to Taiwan. He wants to say, he's asking, what is an acceptable and practical solution to Taiwan? So this is so much of your report, Michael. Michael Swaine, can you talk a little bit about what the U.S. should do on Taiwan and how this problem can be constrained to the point where it doesn't escalate to something very bad?
Sure, Sarang. Let me just, before I do that, just for 1 second, let me just make a couple of comments about what Mike and Kristen just said. I totally acknowledge that the possibility of nuclear war with China is an existential threat. But that type of threat is something that will emerge through the interaction between China and the United States, and mistakes or misperceptions or actions taken by both sides. When people normally talk about China as an existential threat, they don't mean that. Normally, they tend to mean China poses an active, deliberate threat to the United States that could extinguish American existence or American values or American culture or American norms, you name it. It's a much more deliberate kind of pernicious sort of activist view on the part of China. And there, I just don't see that. I don't see the Chinese either intent on doing this or capable of doing it. Yes, nuclear war is a possibility, and we certainly, that's one big thing we're trying to deal with in this report, largely through our recommendations regarding Taiwan. The other point I would say is that I acknowledge that the United States has stated in its policy documents that it recognizes that it's not the same unipolar world that existed after the end of the Cold War. At the same time, the United States and the Department of Defense will make comments and say things which clearly indicate that what they think is a desirable position for the United States is to have a dominant balance of power position. What does that mean? It doesn't mean a genuine balance of power where you're mediating between two powers that have roughly equal levels of capability, and you're trying to establish some mutual understanding there with a recognition that neither can become really dominant. I believe it is an impetus towards establishing a real, sustained, very clear edge. That means, to a great extent, dominance. And if you look at this, most recently, the Council on Foreign Relations just came out with a study on Taiwan, and the recommendations in there were certainly not about a balanced, evenly balanced kind of relationship vis-a-vis Taiwan in the Western Pacific. It was an argument in favor of doubling down very seriously on military assets to achieve a level of dominance in the military side through deterrence that will be so clear to the Chinese that they would never contemplate using force. That is not an argument for a more balanced structure. It's one that I think orients towards a more dominance oriented, and I think it's one that is dangerous because I don't think it's easily obtainable, if at all, and I think it undermines completely the reassurance side of the equation. And I know that CFR is not the U.S. government, but a lot of the people who were in that report force, they were attached to the U.S. government. And a lot of them, I think a lot of what was expressed in that report is reflected in a lot of the documents and thinking in the U.S. government. Now, you want me to make a comment about what to do about the Taiwan situation?
Actually, Michael, just before that, I have a very good question from Jessica Matthews that ties directly to what we have been talking. And this is about really the assumption, I think Mike Mazar made that point, that China is seeking to displace the US as the lead global power. So here, Michael Swaine, you're talking about the US trying to maintain dominance. But is China trying to, in the long run, obviously, become a dominant power in the world? Is that the intent? And do you see signs of that sort of a preparation underway in China?
I mean, I get asked this question all the time. I mean, I was asked it by General Milley years ago. I've been asked it by all sorts of people, and I'm sure we all have been asked this question. I think it's kind of misleading to say, does China desire to deliberately dominate the world or not? What the Chinese want to do is reduce their sense of vulnerability to actions that they believe, either rightly or wrongly, the United States is taking against them. They want to insure themselves against those actions. So they are deliberately seeking to try to preserve their equities, increase their leverage in ways that can anticipate more negative actions on the part of the United States. And of course, the US is doing exactly the same thing. So we've got this interactive dynamic again, in which both sides are assuming the worst case. And if either side is then taking actions that confirm that worst case to the other, then you'll drive the other side increasingly towards seeking dominance, because they think that's the only ready option that they have in order to really insulate themselves. So it's a contingent, dynamic process. I don't think the Chinese have some grand strategy where by year 2050, they dominate the world. I don't believe they have those kinds of objectives. They're thinking very much in terms of achieving certain types of world scale capabilities because they're a great power, because they believe those capabilities are essential for a great power such as themselves. The United States has a very similar type of attitude in that regard. And that dynamic is what then drives the two to calculate as to how much leverage, i.e. influence or even dominance, they might need. So it's a very dynamic process.
Right. I think we are going to build on this and go to Taiwan as a specific example of this is a very important issue. The question that I also asked Kristen and you detailed, Michael, whether this is about a co-constitution, whether this is about a cycle, or whether this is about a actor as a threat. So we all agree that China is doing certain things that are not positive, not constructive, even malicious. But Mike Mazar, is this a co-constitution problem of a cycle of threat and counter-threat and escalation, step by step? Or is it a case of one actor trying to dominate, trying to invade, trying to intrude, and the United States trying to do what it can to really keep things on even keel? Where do you fall on this, or do you have a third or fourth perspective?
Well, I guess my third perspective would be it's both, and I think it is absolutely co-constituted. Any bilateral great power relationship is an interactive dynamic. There is no question that the U.S.-China relationship displays elements of a security dilemma. Some of the points on that in Michael's paper are very well taken, and there are some U.S. actions that are underway, including all of the publicly reported steps in the direction of working more closely with Taiwan in the security realm that I am particularly concerned about as things that are send signals that we are not willing to respect China's core interests. So in some of those areas, I think Michael and I would very much agree. I don't think that is mutually exclusive with the idea that one of the two in a relationship like that can be the primary author of this cycle. And like I said, I do think that the fundamental situation we're dealing with is not only the United States, but the Indo-Pacific and the broader world dealing with a China that, as with just about all great powers at that point in their growth and rise, is shifting their views. I mean, to the last question you asked, Michael, I think the most striking thing to me about this question of how elaborate are China's ambitions is that it changes over time, as has always been the case with great powers. And so my concern is that what we saw 20 years ago is not what we are seeing today in terms of the level of coercive effort to push certain interests. And what we see in 20 more years might be different again. So I think that we're dealing with a dynamic situation that absolutely has elements of a security spiral to which the United States is contributing. Yes. And however, it is also true, I think, that the fundamental driver of the situation is China's changing conception of its interests and its willingness to attempt to force others to agree to its own interpretations of certain issues.
Kristen, do you want to comment on Taiwan specifically and also these broader questions? Where is the source of threat on taking Taiwan as an example and looking at Michael Swaine's recommendations on Taiwan in his paper? Where do you fall on that? Do you find them compelling? Do you have any differences?
Yeah, I largely agree with what Mike said. I do think it is certainly a security dilemma on both sides. From what Michael said earlier, I think the question about whether China aspires to global dominance is, I think that's sort of it's an interesting question, but I agree that there's, they seek to build influence around the world for their own national interests. And I think that is like any great power. But I think when you look at the region, I do think that China does aspire to regional dominance. I think it's a slightly different question. And it's partly because of the way that China sees itself in the region. It sees itself as a dominant regional power. And the more that the United States positions itself to obstruct those interests, the more you get into the security dilemma. So I think that's kind of a fundamental aspect of the U.S.-China dynamic in the region and around Taiwan. I also agree that, with Xi Jinping, we've seen a more, not to use the word again, but more authoritarian bent in Chinese leadership. And that is still evolving in terms of how China's political and security actions will evolve given those leadership dynamics, which I think we don't have a clear view on. And so there's a lot of uncertainty, I guess, in assessing China's intentions. And I think anyone who says they know what they are, you need to take it with a grain of salt. So I would say that just with those two caveats, I do agree with some of the recommendations in the report. I think they make sense in terms of de-escalating the situation. I would also say, just because we've been talking a little bit about rhetoric, is that China really listens to rhetoric coming out of the United States. And so when you hear Congress talking about, getting rid of strategic ambiguity or potential debates about the one China policy, they really pay attention to that. And if it's said publicly in particular, they feel like they have to react to it. And this is something that Chinese counterparts and interlocutors have told me over the years. I'm sure Michael has heard that as well. So toning down the rhetoric, I think, over Taiwan is very important on both sides. But particularly paying attention to what is coming out of Washington, because the Chinese don't always parse that very well, whether it's out of the White House or out of Congress. And so I just wanted to make that point.
Wonderful. Michael Swaine, I want to bring in a question which I think goes to the heart of the Taiwan conversations. And this is something you address in your paper quite well, I think. And the question comes from Edward Grant. And he wants to know, very simply, is the defense of Taiwan a vital national interest of the United States?
Under current conditions, you're talking about this from a broad, sort of open-ended point of view, not what is U.S. policy. Of course, the United States, I don't think, has explicitly said in those exact words that the defense of Taiwan is a vital interest of the United States. It has said in the Taiwan Relations Act that peace and security in Asia is of vital concern to the United States, and the use of war or coercion of Taiwan would be a threat to that peace and security. So you could, I suppose, extrapolate from that to say that any threat to Taiwan security is a vital, defending against that is a vital interest of the United States. Now, our argument in the paper is that over the short to medium term, and given the current disposition of forces and leverage, that the United States should continue its policies regarding the defense of Taiwan as a possibility under strategic ambiguity, not strategic clarity, which is the current policy. It should continue to improve Taiwan's self-defense capabilities and indeed enhance those much beyond what they are today and give Taiwan more leverage and more influence to defend itself. And it should be the primary agent responsible for its defense. But the United States should continue to support it. Now, in the future, as we say in this paper, if we have the less than best outcome, that is to say a continued rivalry between the United States and China that continues to remain, I wouldn't say acrimonious, but very sort of in many ways deeply competitive, zero-sum without extreme hostility, and that China continues to grow at a sufficient rate of growth that its military capabilities continue to amass relative to the United States in that theater regarding Taiwan in that area, then under those conditions, it is prudent for the United States to step back from any kind of intention or desire to intervene directly if a conflict were to emerge, because the United States would most likely not succeed in that kind of a conflict under those conditions. And the United States, in order to avoid escalation to what could potentially be nuclear war, the United States should limit its support for Taiwan to whatever else it can provide short of direct military intervention. That is a kind of a approach that is somewhat resonant or similar to what the United States position is today vis-a-vis Ukraine. But under those, and I stress, under those future types of conditions, where the likelihood of the US employing an effective defense of Taiwan goes down tremendously, under those conditions, it makes little sense for the United States to still embark on the military defense of Taiwan, the direct military defense of Taiwan under those conditions. Now, if you say, well, if Taiwan's a vital interest to the United States, regardless of what US military capabilities might be, we still must intervene because to not do so would be absolutely disastrous for us. Well, that I do not accept.
This is a very, very important point. I want to stress that coming out of this paper, I don't think we in Washington have engaged this as forthrightly as we should. The question of vital interests and Taiwan. On Ukraine, we have been clear, relatively. But on Taiwan, there's still that sort of overhang that we will enter the theater to defend Taiwan under many, many circumstances, or perhaps all. So I think this is a really important point to stress. And I want to sort of open the aperture now beyond Taiwan, because of course, Asia is a big place. And Kristen mentioned Southeast Asia and other areas. I want to go to Japan, because Japan is such an important pillar of the US presence in Asia, Michael Swaine. And the US-Japan alliance in your paper, and we worked on the alliances and partnerships question also last year, Michael, Swaine, and you and I, and we looked at this question of Japan and other allies and partners. Japan is, in your paper, a very core ally and remains that way in the long run. The alliance is, if anything, strengthened in one of your scenarios. So tell us why should we treat Japan differently from Taiwan? Yes, there's of course a legal angle that Japan is an ally and Taiwan is not. But broadening this out beyond legalities, why is Japan so important to the US presence in Asia and US interests in Asia?
Well, if we look at this from a purely sort of bloodless strategic perspective, Japan is a much more serious, much more influential power in the Western Pacific than Taiwan is, by far. Japan has a major military. Japan has a huge economy with major impacts around the world. Japan has major relationships, historically deep relationships, including conflict and grievances with the major powers in the region. It has a very difficult relationship with its, through the United States ally, South Korea. So Japan can play an extremely unpredictable and potentially dangerous role in the region if the United States were to reduce its level of support for Japan to the point where the Japanese felt that they themselves were really having to fend for themselves, or the United States was bypassing them or ignoring them in their interests and ignoring their own interests. So I think that it is essential for the United States, particularly if the US wants to move forward to a future that's designed in the best case option that is in the paper of greater all-around cooperation and interaction, some level of collective security and such that is outlined in the paper as the best case outcome. If you want that future, I think you need to have a close US-Japan working relationship to do that, which will also give leverage in dealing with China, even in that kind of future, to give China greater incentives to be more cooperative and to not engage in more sort of zero-sum interactions with the Japanese that would, I think, undermine the stability of the region for everybody. That's my short assessment of it.
Kristen, do you want to come in on the Japan question, the elements in the report and beyond?
Sure. So my colleagues and I have done some research on this in terms of interviewing restrainers from a number of different camps, and all of them pretty much said that out of anything that they would fight for in the region, it would be for the defense of Japan. And so we recently released a study that looked at that and looked at different scenarios and what exactly the United States would need to defend Japan if a Taiwan conflict were to happen, for example, and we had an East China Sea scenario and a few others. And, what we found is that, Japan does provide the regional balancer to China, so you need to defend it. But from the research we've done, the U.S. still needs a fair amount of military presence in the region, as well as multiple places from which to operate to be able to adequately provide for this type of defense. And so, my point is that the concept of restraint and pulling back U.S. forces from our allies and partners and pulling away from some alliances and partnerships in the region does make sense in some ways. But the reality of what we would actually need in theater in the event of a conflict to defend Japan puts some limitations on that. So I'd be curious to hear Michael's reaction to that, actually, in terms of, and I'm just purely talking about the defense part of the relationship, but obviously there's other reasons to have a close U.S.-Japan relationship too, as the report points out.
I'm happy to respond to that, Kristen, but I don't want to give Mike Mazar the feeling that he's being neglected. And we've been saying several things here that I'm sure he has views on. So maybe if Mike can offer some views before I answer Kristen's question about Japan.
Yeah, please, Mike Mazar.
Well, thank you, Michael. That's very kind. The only thing I would say is, I certainly agree that Japan is a linchpin of the U.S. Security in the region and a stable region. One of the questions, and I'm not saying I have a definitive answer on this, is why Japan and not others? Because Japan is really not interested in the United States considering withdrawing from alliances with the Philippines and Thailand, which the report advocates under some potential future conditions. I understand it's conditional, but it is conditional in a world where China's power is growing and U.S. predominance is declining, and withdrawing from those alliances would, I think, create exactly the kinds of dynamics in Japan that the report rightly warns about in some other places of, a potential for nuclear arsenal and other kinds of things. So one of the key strategic questions in the United States, obviously, is if what we say about Japan in terms of maintaining relations with certain key security and alliance hubs to sustain regional equilibrium and stability is true, how broadly is that principle true? And I think it is very much true of the Philippines. It has become true of the Philippines, given South China Sea disputes. given a variety of other things, given the perception of other countries in the region. And then the million-dollar question is it true of Taiwan? And I won't raise that question again. You know, we touched on it briefly. I think, Sarang, you're absolutely right that we desperately need a broader public debate about an issue that we are making an implicit judgment about, that we may fight for a place that gets us into the most destructive war in American history,
Right.
and then look back later and say, did we really have a vital interest there? I'm not advocating, you know, cutting Taiwan loose by any means, but it would be profoundly irresponsible for the United States to get to that kind of a judgment without having the American public really knowing what's going on. So I think that is the question that this discussion of Japan raises. And I would have a somewhat different view probably than Michael. But again, we're talking about, you know, differences of emphasis in kind of a middle ground here. And in the point where you started, Michael, on sort of the basic commitment to Japan, I'm totally with you.
In fact, yeah, Michael, please, Michael
Well,
Swaine.
I'm just saying, I mean, I agree with that. I think it's critical. I mean, there is a danger, obviously, if the United States in a less best case, if you will, future were to decide to pull back on its commitments and establish with, say, the Philippines and with Thailand what we call preferred partnerships, which is a concept that Sarang actually came up with when we wrote an earlier paper about this. What kind of possible instability could that create in Southeast Asia, for example? That, of course, we cannot say for sure. But the point was to really affirm that under that kind of a future, where China has vastly more important capability to operate along its periphery, that a clear-cut, unambiguous U.S. military security commitment to the defense of those two nations would probably produce far more dangers than it would produce positive outcomes in terms of effective deterrence. If the United States was still involved in a somewhat adversarial or quite adversarial relationship with the Chinese, I think it would pose a greater degree of risk for the United States than otherwise. But that's a judgment call. That's a debate we can have. It's probably a subject of an entirely separate hour-long discussion about this. But I think in the case of Japan, it's much less ambiguous. In the case of Japan, there is a clear need to have a degree of a relationship, of a security relationship with Japan that can operate in ways that provide predictability, reduce uncertainty, balance in some ways against China, and also provide incentives for China to be in some ways more cooperative. So I would say, in answering Kristen's question, for sure, under that future situation, the United States would still need to be, in fact, in some ways increase its military presence with Japan under those. And here's where I would differ with people like Barry Posen or other people in the restraint camp, where they postulate a kind of offshore balancing role for the United States, where the United States pulls back to Guam or Hawaii even, and just basically seeks to influence the geostrategic dynamics from afar, intervening where necessary. I think that is an unrealistic kind of a situation for the United States to be in, particularly under that sort of that more adverse outcome that we see for the future as one of our two options. Under the best case option, I think that is a more plausible, more conceivable type of posture for the United States to have, but we're nowhere near that right now.
So Kristen, I want to sort of take a step back and build on what Michael Swaine just said. It's sort of a broader sense from the report and the work that we have done at QI earlier as well, that when China is growing, we all know that Chinese growth has been phenomenal in the past 30 years. It's unprecedented, perhaps, in history. The rate of growth, now the Chinese economy comparable, even if it slows down quite a lot, it's still a very, very large economy. And we have laid lines in the sand, or let's say lines in the water, in this case, in Asia, that were laid down decades back. When power balances shift so radically, so fast, shouldn't we in the United States reconsider those lines? What is defensible? What is vital? How do we adjust it so that America is stronger and stays in the region in a way that's constructive for a long haul and not overcommit to some of these relationships with the smaller countries, particularly, that may not be so vital and may not be so defensible?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think it's less about maybe committing to them and more about acknowledging the reality of what we will get from those commitments, particularly in conflict versus in peacetime. And again, I'll kind of draw my military background because that's what I've mainly been looking at. But I mean, the countries in Southeast Asia that we've done extensive research on in terms of whether they would, for example, allow access to U.S. military forces in a conflict. You know, we looked at the political context, we looked at the economic context, and several other factors, and all of them pretty much. And I'm talking about, you know, Thailand, Indonesia, Singapore, even to some extent places like South Korea. They by and large are very concerned about things like Chinese economic retaliation. And when you look at the economic reliance on China, that concern makes a lot of sense. And they are concerned about, you know, again, sort of having a constructive relationship both with China and with the United States, and not having to choose sides. And I think the Biden administration understands that, and some of their approach to ASEAN and you know, building relationships in Southeast Asia has encompassed that reality. But I do, so I think that it is when we look at U.S. commitments to those countries, not that we necessarily shouldn't have them, but we have to acknowledge the reality on the ground, the political realities and the domestic realities that these countries are facing with regard to China, which is in their backyard and is, you know, is a country that they need to have a relationship with.
Mike, Meza Kristen makes a great point that these countries are tied to China in a way that maybe other parts of the world aren't. They're proximate. And when I look at the empirical trend, I see two initiatives from the US, the Quad, which is less about hard security, really, at least as claimed, and AUKUS. And the region hasn't exactly danced with joy broadly. Australia, of course, Japan. But Southeast Asia takes a very nuanced, sometimes critical view of this. Not that they don't want to play ball to some extent, but they don't want to jump in headlong into these mini laterals or blocks, if you will. So the region is sending us signals that are not quite aligned with where we are trying to go. Isn't that accurate?
Well, I think the signals are mixed, and I wouldn't say that region is sending us signals that we're in the wrong direction. I think they're sending us signals that they don't want to get caught in the middle of a U.S. China conflict or an intense technological kind of economic technological rivalry. But you know, as everybody I'm sure finds. When you go and talk to people in the region, it is this sort of dilemma, right? Or this they want two things at the same time. They want to hedge, and they don't want the conflict to be too bad, and they don't want the U.S. to push U.S.-China relations off a cliff, but they don't want the United States to leave. Because in most cases, as Kristen said, they appreciate the risks of living in a region where China is a power that can show up on their doorstep and say, here's a bunch of changes we'd like you to make to your domestic economy, or here's a professor we'd like you to quiet down from, you know, complaining about us. They want autonomy and they want sovereign independence, which China's rhetoric says it wants to give everybody. So I think there is the U.S. is balancing so many dilemmas and sort of contradictory factors here, and that's definitely one of them. I think it's relatively easily, you know, I think some of the spirit in Michael's report I agree with, in the sense of, if the United States really focuses on a positive agenda of driving multilateral collaboration on certain issues of mutual concern, sustainable development, climate, other things, and then responds to Chinese provocations when they happen, instead of making the primary U.S. message about the rivalry, I think that will go a long way to kind of setting a context in the region where people feel like we're responsible. But I think it is, and then I know Michael doesn't argue this in the report at all, but it's definitely wrong to imply that many countries in the region believe the United States is the problem and just wish that we would kind of go away.
Right.
Michael Swaine, I want to give you the last word. This is a good point. We don't have a lot of time, but just in 2 minutes, can you build a bit on Mike Mazar's point and talk about your cooperative vision? Because he's talking about constructive actions that are perhaps less visible right now from the US.
Well, this constructive vision is really one in which, through changes in mindset, very much along the lines of what Mike just mentioned, that is to say, dropping these kinds of zero-sum depictions and framing of the U.S.-China relationship as this grand titanic struggle between democracy and authoritarianism, as the great power competition is at the center of geopolitics around the world. We must win an intense competition with China, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, repeated as ad nauseum by U.S. officials. That should change. There needs to be a clear recognition that neither side is going to be dominant over the other, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region. And I take Kristen's point about the Chinese wanting to dominate, possibly wanting to dominate the region, although again, I think that's to some degree contingent, but it's certainly not helpful if that is their objective. No side is going to dominate the region in the future. So there has to be a recognition that there needs to be an ability to reach some kind of middle ground and by doing that, establish the capacity to then focus on those areas where we really need genuine cooperation. In other words, we establish a middle ground in these contentious areas where we're both willing to give to some degree in order to get a kind of sustained situation. And most importantly, that is Taiwan, which we really haven't talked about the details of that, but maybe we can in a future event. But if we do that, then we provide some of the political space to allow for initiatives to be taken in the cooperative area in a whole range of different areas, economic, technological, not just military security, and to address those common threats that we face that are so fundamental that we are putting really on the back burner in our geostrategic competition with the Chinese. And we all know what those are: climate, pandemics, cyber issues, financial instability, WMD proliferation. I mean, these are threats to all of us. And so we need to be able to create that political space and engage in more cooperative interactions, and can only do that if we begin to alter the framing and the narrative which both sides employ and this blame game that we have. And if you ask me, well, how do we do that? We've got to be able to do that by starting small, as people often say. We've got to be able to continue the momentum that we have right now through the Blinken trip, have more honest recognition here of our limitations along with our strengths, and be able to get the same from the Chinese side and have a series of sustained discussions with the Chinese that talk about these fundamental issues and where it is that we can agree with each other and what it would take to reach that kind of an agreement outside of the instant media cameras posturing that goes on from all sides. If we can establish that kind of dynamic with the Chinese, then we have a chance of creating these kinds of cooperative interactions, I think.
Well, that will have to be the last word. We could easily talk for another hour, perhaps the whole day on this. There's a lot in that paper. Read the paper. It's on our website. And please stay tuned for many more events from the Quincy Institute on Asia and other areas. I want to thank all our panelists, Kristen, Mike Mazar, and of course, Michael Swaine, for a rich discussion today. And thank you very much to all our viewers.